Today's culture has really moved in recent years. We are seeing a lot of people who are seem to be disconnected from their faith, and values have become something that people assume to be true, but are not quite rooted in anything. It's interesting to see what happens in a society where once they are uncoupled from a common religious faith or a common belief system, start to form in factions. And we're seeing this today. Most interestingly in all of this is the rise of what they would call the alt-right. For many Christians who have derided some of the tactics that those on the left have used for cancel culture and things like that as not virtuous, we've seen kind of a backlash now where folks who claim to be conservative are using those same tactics against their opponents. How can we as Christians understand what it means to be virtuous in a society that no longer holds virtue as a value? That's our discussion on this. Come, let us reason together. Well, hi again, everyone. This is Lenny Esposito of Come Let Us Reason, and I'm pleased today to engage with you in a topic that I think is really important and actually not getting a lot of coverage, at least not enough as it should be, about folks who are claiming to be on the right, but their approach seems to be adopting practices that were just a few years ago derided by conservatives as mean-spirited and antithetical to the idea of an upright and moral society. Now, I didn't want to tackle this alone, so I'm bringing on my good friend, Dr. Neil Shenvi. Many of you would be familiar with Neil from his book, Critical Dilemma. But for those of you who don't know, Dr. Shenvi graduated from Princeton University as an undergraduate and then did a PhD in theoretical chemistry, believe it or not, at UC Berkeley, which is actually fascinating because he no longer practices theoretical chemistry as a profession. He actually homeschools his kids. And he says in his bio that he plays with quantum mechanics just as a side hobby, which if you understand anything about quantum mechanics, I don't even know how you can play with it like that. It's something that's abridged. But as I said, he's become an expert and really one of the go-to voices to talk about critical theory, critical race theory, and other things like that. And what Neil has been commenting on recently is the alarming rise of individuals on the far right who have adopted some of the tactics that we had previously criticized the far left for using, saying that they were baseless. But now we're starting to see all these things happen together. So first of all, welcome, Neil. Glad to talk with you again. Of course, you were one of our guests on our Dare to Defend conference earlier this year and did a wonderful job discussing critical theory and all that entails and how that robs us of the Imago Dei. Before we get started into our own topic, why don't you tell me a little bit more about what got you interested in this specific subject, since it seems to be a little bit far afield from, say, theoretical chemistry?
Oh, well, that goes back, years ago to when I finished my first book, Why Believe, and was looking around for some other project to do in my spare time. And Why Believe was a basic apologetics book, talked about issues like the resurrection, the uniqueness of Jesus, things like that. And around that time it was the rise of Black Lives Matter. Is it 2016, 2015? And so I began seeing these things in our culture that confused me. I didn't understand why Black Lives Matter, for example, would emphasize sexuality. This is a group that's about racial justice, but then they always were talking about queerness and wanting to deconstruct heteronormativity, and I couldn't understand it. So around that same time, I met my collaborator, Dr. Pat Sawyer, who was getting his PhD in education and cultural studies. We began collaborating, and out of our collaboration, last year we published Critical Dilemma, because we just spent a lot of time trying to understand and explain these various critical social theories like critical race theory, queer theory, etc., that were clearly captivating culture, and even parts of the evangelical church. So again, I got involved in that like kind of everyone did around 2016, seeing something happening. I couldn't put my finger on what, but then I tried to understand that, and that's when I got into the subject.
Okay, so that's kind of how you started down this path, was to just try to understand. Then you quickly, as you researched it, and of course you did something that most people don't do, is you went through and you started reading all the primary sources to understand it better. And a matter of fact, your site, neilshenviapologetics.com, has a wonderful catalog of book reviews of those primary sources, and something I do recommend people go and see if you want to find out what the folks who hold to critical race theory or critical theory writ large. A lot of people don't understand that CRT is actually just one subset of critical theory, as you said. It's a good place to start, but even your book, Critical Dilemma, you don't spend a lot of time kind of explaining or interpreting their points of view. You simply quote them. You simply say, here's what they believe because here's their words. And you really don't have to say, here's my interpretation of what that means. It's pretty clear by their words what they mean. So it's pretty hard for them to deny or refute this because you're actually using their content.
Yeah, I think it's important because they do push back and say you're misinterpreting us. And I keep saying we're not misinterpreting you, we're quoting you. These are your own words. And we don't just have one or two words or phrases. We have block quotes, thousands and thousands of words of verbatim quotes from primary sources. That is important, and I've tried to really stay close to their intent. And the first half of the book is really just understanding these ideas. We don't even critique them until the second half of the book. Our editor actually warned us, cautioned us. People would think we were woke because it reads like we're promoting these ideas. We had to tell them, no, we're not. We're just explaining them very accurately. And it becomes clear, obviously, at the end of the book that we're rejecting these ideas. But we wanted to really capture what the authors intended to write, what they really understood and what they meant, rather than caricaturing them.
Well, that's really important, and it's a marked difference from, say, what I do see when I read the folks who are proponents of this project. Many of them won't, if you even ask them to define it, what are the parameters? What does critical theory look like? How do we define what's critical theory? They simply won't define themselves what their movement actually entails, or what its telos is, what its end result needs to be. They just refuse to come down, and maybe there's a little bit of postmodernism that's coming into play because of that. But it becomes frustrating to dialogue when you have a point where they just won't make any definitions themselves. So you almost have to do it for them in that regard. But okay, so we saw in 2016 the rise of this, right? And as you said, you start to see it, and of course 2020 it comes into full fruition with the Black Lives Matter riots that are happening across the country, with the rise of the Biden administration. Diversity, equity, inclusion movements start to go. You start to get BlackRock and all of these social justice movements within corporate America. But it seems like the last couple of years, there's been more shaky ground in this area. For example, just today, Microsoft announced that it's laid off its entire DEI staff. That's huge. That's amazing. Of course, you can't blame that. I mean, there's Florida, there's DeSantis, and that whole movement. But people scapegoat that as saying, well, that's just because they're Republicans and they're looking for the vote. Microsoft is not run by Republicans. We know this to be true. But they've unplugged their entire DEI program. What do you see that's changing now? What's happening to make this shift, do you think?
I think there are a lot of things. One is just conservative activism. Like Chris Rufo has done a lot of work exposing what people are teaching in corporate America, what they're requiring their employees to sit through in terms of their diversity training. And that's created a huge backlash. There's also the slogan, go woke, go broke. Doesn't always work out that way, but Target, there's a huge boycott of Target last summer because of their Pride Month displays, and that did take a toll on Target. This year's Pride Month, actually around across the board, was much more muted than it's ever been, I think. Bud Light, they had the transgender Dylan Mulvaney, was it? But
right, yeah. Boy, that was a train wreck. I mean, and that got so much press. I think a lot of presidents like stood up in their chairs and said, "I don't want to sacrifice my corporate profits for this."
That's right. And they're beginning to see an actual monetary backlash and they are capitalists. People often confuse critical theory with communism. And we put out in the book, it's important to distinguish the two, because think about it. If that were just true, if this was just communism or Marxism, why is it that so many Fortune 500 companies have DEI departments? They're spending billions on this stuff. So somehow it's not just about proletariat revolution and class warfare. It's something beyond that. And of course it is. It's actually neo-Marxism. And if you understand the difference, you'll realize why that's compatible with these very rich companies. Anyway, I think we're seeing a backlash due to activism. I think public awareness, you have sites like or accounts like Libs of TikTok just showing what run-of-the-mill progressives, or not run-of-the-mill, progressive activists actually believe. We had during COVID, a lot of people had their kids Zooming into school and were seeing what their teachers were teaching these kids and were horrified by it and pulled them out of school. I think all of those things conspired or added up to create the current pullback. I wouldn't say destruction, but the pullback, the deceleration of wokeness in our culture. I would very much caution people, though, not to think we've hit peak woke. I saw even a year ago, conservatives, some of them were saying we've hit peak woke. I think the assumption was we can't get any worse. We're so bad already, it can't get worse. I think that's not true. And actually, I think the Hamas attacks on October 7th last year showed it was not true. While most Americans were just recoiling at seeing a Hamas murder millions, hundreds of Israeli civilians, there was a subset of America that was supporting Hamas, not just Palestine, but Hamas. So Black Lives Matter grassroots published a statement in solidarity with Hamas. Black Lives Matter Chicago posted a tweet with a paragliding terrorist that said, I stand with Palestine. It was not just a vague statement about Palestine. It was a terrorist paragliding into Israel to murder civilians. They had a cartoon of it, and they stood with Palestine. People saw that kind of, and there's lots more. There were groups like Queers for Palestine and going to protests. There were Jews on campus being yelled at and feeling fighting for their safety. All of that, again, showed people that we have not hit peak woke. And I think even now, with more and more corporations pulling out of the DEI game, you have a generation of kids who's been raised knowing nothing but wokeness. I mean, here's one stat that's kind of shocking. 27% of, I think it's Zoomers maybe, but 27% identify as LGBTQ.
Right.
It's huge. That's going to change when as they get older, when they enter the workforce, when they become your senators, your doctors, your judges, your pastors. It's not going away. So it's not time for us to sit back and think it's all taken care of. We're done. Wokeness is peaked. We have to continue to fight it in the church and in the culture.
So I think that's really important. I think we also want to do a little bit of clarification, because while you say 27% identify, they grab onto the label. They don't necessarily enact the lifestyle. So, for That's example, right. you have a group of ladies who've taken on the new moniker of demisexuality, right? And you say, what's demisexuality? And they say, well, it's a subset of the LGBTQ plus. It's the plus, right? It's a different kind of sexual orientation where I can't be sexually active with a person unless I know that there's an emotional connection first. We've had 3 or 4 dates, and only then do I feel comfortable enough to open myself sexually. So it's a subset of my sexual orientation. And you come back and you say, well, that's called normal. That's called what most people in the 70s felt, right? It was, so but it has to have a label, and you have to be an oppressed group. You have to be every young person is looking for victimhood through some way, shape, or form, so that they could have their little niche group to say that I'm not part of the oppressor class. I'm not what. The only thing that we're trying to avoid is being labeled as the oppressor class, because that's the only piece where you lose. If you're not part of the oppressor class, then you can be accepted because my victimization is your victimization. And of course, we even see this with kids talking about being oppressed by their parents, right? It's my parents who are the oppressor class, who have oppressed me, and they draw that out. So I do want to be a little bit careful, because in terms of actual actions and living out, I don't believe that 27% of our population is going to live a homosexual lifestyle. I think the numbers are still at about 3%. It's growing. It has gained more acceptance, and the more acceptance you get in the culture, the more people are going to experiment, and the fewer social pressures that you have, or the looser moral standards that you have, will allow a few more people to get in. So you maybe see 3 to 5%, which is traditionally very, very high. It was usually 1.5%, and of that 1.5%, only 0.5% were female, same-sex attracted, and the other, 75% were male. That's been the traditional standards. I think that has changed, but it still won't be. Nature still is in there for the vast majority of people. So I think that's an important point. So along with all of this, though, and again, the whole idea of critical theory is you have an oppressor class and an oppressed class. And the whole structure of our civilization and our culture is such that you can't escape even non-conscious acts of oppression. If you're part of the oppressed class, the whole structure of civilization is built in such a way that you're going to be oppressed whether you like it or not. Unpacking the invisible knapsack, if you will, that kind of thing. So along with this then comes certain responses, certain reactions, and we saw it primarily in the college culture first, right? We saw the idea of microaggressions, for example, and trigger words and safe spaces. And that concept grew into then ideas of not allowing those oppressor types to even speak, because they're going to injure me with their verbal oppressions, and they're going to inflict emotional damage upon me, right? Is that a fair summation of kind of part of what happened when we were seeing this thing rise, that this became a big part of the college ideology, and a lot of kids from both the left and the right kind of absorb this idea that somebody who holds a different opinion than you can actually hurt you. He can actually do violence by speaking an opinion maybe that you don't have, and those kinds of hurts needed to be mitigated. Is that fair?
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff talk about this phenomenon in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind, where they talk about how college students just they bought into all this ideology that said words are violence, you should be kept safe. They talk about the safetyism, this need to keep everyone happy and to protect them, to never have them meet opinions they don't feel comfortable with. And there's other issues. Two sociologists, Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning, wrote a book called The Rise of Victimhood Culture. They're both Christian sociologists, and they wrote a great book about just how victimhood is the currency of our culture, especially on college campuses. So everybody wants to be a victim because they realize that will give them power. They can call the administrator and they can get their voice heard, and they can punish their enemies. So those two books are very good at addressing the sort of ideology behind safe spaces, microaggressions, trigger warnings on college campuses. And they argued that it's spreading beyond just college campuses. And they wrote those books like 5 years ago, so it's already dated.
Well, yeah, and I think they're right, because then what we saw was a shift to social media, and
Mm.
now you had people who were looking at people's social media feeds, not only for people who they found objectionable now, but they were searching people's history and then calling employers and saying, "Do you want to hire this guy? 10 years ago, he said X." Right,
Mm.
and so that cancel culture starts to permeate society and have radical effects on individuals. And oh my gosh, when you're 15, you say things that, yeah, you probably regret when you're 30. But in an age where we live online and we put every single thought out there the moment we think it, that's a real dangerous precedent. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because there was a reaction from the right, the Ben Shapiro's of the world and things like that. We call these guys snowflakes, right? Oh, my facts don't care about your feelings. You have this response kind of thing. However, today things seem to be shifting, and this kind of goes to the point that you made, that you had an entire culture, an entire generation of kids grow up in this ideology where they started to maybe reject some of the political stances, but they assumed the underlying premises of feelings based existence, and how how hurts become important and should be quelled and things like that. So now you're starting to see people on the right use the same tactics to try and get people on the left unplugged or canceled or doxxed or whatever. And that's been concerning. And I know that you've been starting to talk about this. And so can you explain a little bit about this idea of the alt-right and what you're seeing as the counter to the woke left?
Yeah, this is something that was very new to me. So, I have approached wokeness on the left, at least, we call it left-wing wokeness, from what you could argue is basically a classical liberal perspective, and hopefully one that's informed by the Bible. It's just saying things like, look, human beings are made in God's image, therefore we all have certain inalienable rights that we should respect. Doesn't matter if they're the rights of our enemies or our friends. They're human rights because we are made in God's image. Uh, we one of the things that we value in America is freedom of speech. We should not police speech. We should not police people's consciences. We should let them express their beliefs, sincerely held beliefs. We should only restrict violence, physical violence. Words are not violence. We value freedom of religion, and people should be allowed to practice their religion unmolested by the state. We do not want a state church. Things like this. And this is, I kind of maybe naively assumed that, and not naively, most evangelicals, even today, would agree with those statements. They would still basically be traditional freedom of speech conservatives who would try to exact equal standards, would want to see facts over feelings, would want to not see the world in terms of oppression and oppressed and oppressors and victimizers. They would see us as individuals primarily, and we should treat people as individuals. They would favor color blindness as a standard, that we should, again, not see people as avatars of their race or their ethnicity or their gender. We should treat them as individuals. So all those things, again, I approached the woke left from the perspective. Well, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago maybe, I began engaging with the Christian nationalist movement. At the time, interestingly, I got involved in that discussion of Christian nationalism not because I was interested in it, but because when I was criticizing wokeness and the dangers of critical theory, I was being told by progressives that it was a boogeyman. The real danger was Christian nationalism. This was 2.5 years ago, that I'm wasting my time picking on these crazy lunatics on campuses when the real threat to our sacred democracy is the Christian nationalists. So I said, okay, wait, let me give me some books to read. So they gave me book recommendations to read. So I read Whitehead and Perry's Taking America Back for God. I read books like Kristen Kubez Dumay's Jesus and John Wayne, Beth Allison Barr's The Making of Biblical Womanhood. I read a number of other, I'm trying to think of all the books that I read on
Wolf.
Christian national. Well, no, that's different. So I began by reading books that were more progressive, who
Okay.
were saying things like Christian nationalism is a terrible danger. And having read those books, I reviewed them and I said, look, I don't think this is a real threat. What you're calling Christian nationalism, a lot of it is just basic Christianity, like the idea that the government should make laws that are grounded in Christian values. Yes, we should. Why? Well, what's some Christian values? Things like thou shalt not murder. All life is valuable. Um, uh, don't steal. Those are Christian values, yes or no? Yeah. So
Yeah.
obviously, that should not be described as Christian nationalism. Any Christian that does not believe thou shalt not murder is not a Christian. That's God's moral law. Or another criteria by which Whitehead and Perry judged Christian nationalists is they said if Christian nationalism correlates with the belief that heterosexuality is God's design. And I said,
Wow.
but it is though. That's not.
Yeah,
That's not
sort of the
Christian
biological
nationalism.
text. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. So, my takeaway. This again was like 2.5 years ago. I read that book and I said, look, I sympathize. Some of your concerns are real. There are people, for example, that when surveyed said that the Constitution is divinely inspired. It was something like 60% of evangelicals said the Constitution is divinely inspired. That's alarming. I like the Constitution a lot. It's not inspired. It's not God-given. That's why we amend it. But the point is, so they have real concerns, but then some of their concerns are either overstated or outright wrong. It's not a danger to the nation or against abortion. Doesn't make you a Christian nationalist. It makes you a rational Christian and even a good moral person. Okay. So then, however, I went on Lisa Childers' podcast and had a whole podcast with her and saying, basically, I think that they are using this blanket broad label of Christian nationalism to smear people. They're basically having Christian beliefs. So that's bad. It's really just a boogeyman, frankly.
Well, it falls into the same problem as we talked about with critical theories. Like, what are the definitional attributes? What are the essential attributes of to make one Christian nationalist? And again, I've not seen that list. Nobody has said here are the essential aspects, the necessary and sufficient conditions, if you're going to use philosophical terminology, in order to be defined as Christian nationalist.
So Whitehead and Perry did have the survey. They said, these are the questions we asked. But when I went through the questions, they were not good questions. They were way too ambiguous. And then occasionally when they were clear, they were answers. I would have said, every Christian should say yes to this. Yes, we want, laws grounded in Christian values. Now, or yes, one question was, should the government allow prayer in schools? And I'm thinking, are we going to forbid it? Like, what do you mean prayer in schools? Being silent prayers in your head? Do you mean teacher-led prayers? Do you mean a Christian group that meets off campus? So the point is, again, I was critical of that book. I thought this book is making a mountain out of a molehill. It's not just the way they've designed the study is not great scientifically. Okay, but then fast forward to November 2022. And I forget what brought it up, but then a guy named Stephen Wolfe published a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism. So he's an evangelical Christian. He was in the PCA at the time, a conservative Presbyterian denomination. And he wrote a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism. It was published by Doug Wilson, who's also a Reformed pastor out in Idaho, by his publishing company. And he plugged the book and said, if you're going to critique Christian nationalism, this is what you have to critique. This is the book on Christian nationalism. So his Canon Press publishing company actually tweeted at me and said, read this book. This is what, if you're critical of this movement, this is what you have to read. So I said, okay. So I bought the book and I read it. And I and many other people have read the book, and then we critiqued it and said, hey, there's some things, again, that are good about it. We can actually affirm, but there are a number of things in this book that are actually wrong theologically, politically, historically. There are probably 12, 24 of these reviews out there that criticize the book from all different angles. And but one of the reviews that was interesting to what we're going to talk about was a review by Kevin DeYoung, who's a Presbyterian pastor writing for the Gospel Coalition. And he also said, well, the book has some positives, but it has a lot of negatives. And he entitled the review of his book, The Rise of Right-Wing Wokeism. That was the title of his book review of Stephen Wolfe's book, The Rise of Right-Wing Wokeism. I want to quote to you from just one paragraph in his review, because what he argues is that Stephen Wolfe's book is basically a mirror image of the woke left in terms of what he assumes about reality, what he assumes about politics, what he assumes about truth and knowledge and power. So here's one of the paragraphs in DeYoung's review of Wolfe's book. He says this: if critical race theory teaches that America has failed, that the existing order is irredeemable, that Western liberalism was a mistake from the beginning, that the current system is rigged against our tribe, and that we ought to make ethnic consciousness more important, it seems to me that Wolfe's project is the right-wing version of these same impulses. In other words, he says, look, if I said to you, imagine a person who believes that America's failed, the existing order it can't be fixed, it has to be radically transformed. Liberalism is a mistake. We should never have had liberalism. It just doesn't work. The current system is against you. It's oppressing a demographic group that you belong to, and it's promoting the people that are the opposite group. And you need to really identify with your ethnic group. And then you have to have an ethnic consciousness. And actually more than that, if I told you those criteria, you'd say, well, that's woke, that's critical race theory, okay? And his point is that, well, that's what Wolfe believes. He believes all those things, and in fact, and then this is DeYoung again. He says in his review, when Wolfe sarcastically thanks those who quote woke many from their dogmatic slumber, and rejoices that quote more are awakening every day, one might be forgiven for seeing his version of Christian nationalism as a form of right-wing wokeism. And he closes with this: what does it mean to be woke if not that we're awakened to the reality that oppression is everywhere, extreme measures are necessary, and the regime must be overthrown? So in his review, this is like 2022, he's saying Wolfe's book is embracing the very same ideas as the woke left, except that it's all flipped. The oppressed peoples are not people of color. It's actually straight white males. And then the oppressors are the regime. And liberalism is actually, he would agree with critical race theory, liberalism is deeply flawed. It's a vessel for the ruling class to keep, in his case, straight white males down and to marginalize them. Now you say, well, does he really say things like that? Well, I'll get out a few more things. A quote from his book. These are quotes from Wolfe's book that Kevin DeYoung highlights. So here are some quotes verbatim from Stephen Wolfe's book. Quote, every step of progress is overcoming you. Ask yourself, what sort of villain does each event of progress have in common? The straight white male. That is the chief outgroup of New America, the embodiment of regression and oppression, end quote. Another quote, we live in a gynocracy, a rule by women. So, feminists believe we live in a patriarchy. Well, Stephen Wolfe says we live under a gynocracy, a rule by women. This may not be apparent on the surface. Does that sound familiar? Like it looks like you can't see, but really, yeah. This may not be apparent on the surface since men still run many things. But the governing virtues of America are feminine vices associated with certain feminine virtues such as empathy, fairness, and equality. Here's one last one. Quote, if you are a white, heterosexual, cisgendered male, then the world will not offer you any favors. Indeed, your career advancement depends on sacrificing your self-respect, by praising and pandering to your inferiors who rule over you. So I could go on. My point is, that's why DeYoung, I think rightly, says this sounds like it's lifted right out of Robin DiAngelo's books, except all of the people are reversed. It's not the patriarchy who's controlling you, it's the gynocracy. It's not black lesbians who are the bottom of the barrel, who are being oppressed by these subtle social forces. It's actually straight white men that are being oppressed. But in both worldviews, the ruling class has victimized your group not through overt discrimination. Even admits, yeah, well, white men rule a lot of stuff. White men control lots of stuff, but it's through these subtle narratives, these values, these norms. They're actually feminine. They're subtle things you don't recognize, but they're in the end they are keeping you down, making you sacrifice your self-respect, and forcing you to pander to your inferiors. So I think DeYoung, and that was 2 years ago, was right to see this is a form of right-wing wokeism. And then, okay, so that's where we get that. I think, as far as I can tell, evangelicals began to use that phrase, woke right, based on DeYoung's usage of that term, right-wing wokeism. And I've argued also, a number of other people have talked about the woke right and see the similarity in what the woke left and the woke right believe, only with the roles reversed.
So I know a lot of folks will say, well, I don't see that. I don't see that in my churches. I don't see that. And, Jonah Goldberg has responded to those kinds of claims. He goes, well, if you look at the charismatic movement, and a lot of the Pentecostal churches, even the new apostolic Reformation churches, you tend to see a lot more of this, which to some degree makes sense, because the more charismatic you are, the more the churches tend to be much more feelings oriented anyway. That's what drives the Pentecostal movement is the feeling of the Holy Spirit, catching the fire, and it's more emotionally laden. And so it would be no surprise that and those churches are growing. They are part of broader evangelical, non-denominational movement that's being decoupled from mainstream denominationalism and exploding. So that it may be there, but how big do you actually think this is? Is the alt-right merely relegated to those folks, to the quote Christian nationalists unquote, or is there another subset of perhaps secular conservatives who are also taking up these kinds of ideas and saying we're going to go after that? Well, for example, we've now got J.D. Vance, who's our vice presidential candidate. And he seems to have said in a couple of interviews that he doesn't necessarily want to dismantle the state. He wants to take those tools that have already been built by the left and turn them around against them. So are there those who aren't Christian who are adopting those same kinds of frameworks?
Yeah, so when I talked about the woke right initially, I used the term the dissident right. So the dissident right kind of is an outgrowth of the alt-right. That was more of like a 2010s. The alt-right was big then, and people like Richard Spencer. And they were ethno-nationalists, generally speaking. They really felt they strongly emphasized ethnic consciousness. They wanted America to be some form of an ethno-state. And that seems to have merged with this group that calls themselves the dissident right, which is also, it's a nebulous group. One of the problems, Lenny, that I've had is that this is almost entirely an internet age phenomenon. If you look, like, what are the books they read? Well, they read like these old, well, not all old books, but they'll read books like Carl Schmitt, who is actually a German Nazi political theorist who wrote a book called The Concept of the Political. There's a book called The Demise of the West by a guy named Burnham. I think I have it. I just bought it. But a lot of these books they're reading are old, but mainly this group is an online phenomenon. They hang out on like 4chan and Reddit slash Paul, like these, and they make podcasts and videos. But I like primary sources, but I like books to read. I can highlight and have it in writing, and I don't really want to listen to like 3 hours of some guy ramble on about a white ethno state. So it's hard. It's been hard for me just to wrap my head around what they're actually teaching. One, because it is diverse. There are people that are kind of just paleo conservatives, they would call themselves. They kind of after the model of Pat Buchanan. They would say we believe what people believed 50 years ago. That's all. It's no different. And even there, I'd be like, well, 50 years ago or 60 years ago, I mean, interracial marriage was illegal. Do you believe that? So just they say, well, we just believe what conservatives believed 60 years ago. And I'm saying, yeah, but conservatives believed some bad things back then too, right? I mean, you can't that's not an immediate excuse. Whereas other people are believing things that are completely different. I mean, there are monarchists. There are people that want to restore a monarchy, or they're so it's diverse. What I do try to identify though is, like Kevin DeYoung, when I read a book, I say, yeah, here are some things they said. And the things they're saying, A, they're false. B, they seem to fit into a larger framework that I would characterize as the woke right. So when I characterize the woke right, I had a tweet. 2 years ago, I had a tweet, one tweet defining the left, defining wokeness. What is wokeness? And to define wokeness, I put it this way. I said woke means 4 things. 1, society is divided into oppressed and oppressor groups along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. That's number 1. That's what it means to be woke. Via 2, hegemonic power. Hegemonic power means the ability of the ruling class to impose their values on you, whether it's the patriarchy, white supremacy, cisgenderism. But you're creating this social binary of oppressor and oppressed because the ruling classes are imposing their values on you. So that's number 2. But because of that, privileged people, oppressors, are blind. They can't see the reality of oppression. So number 3, we need to defer to the lived experience of the marginalized. People of color, women, LGBTQ people, they can see reality. We should defer to them. And then the purpose of wokeness is to dismantle unjust systems. So that's a 4-fold definition of wokeness I used in my book. Well, a few months ago, I defined the woke right, or the dissident right. Here's how I define the dissident right. Same 4 beliefs. Number 1, society is divided into straight white men and their enemies. Right? So you same social binary, but now it's straight white men on the bottom and their enemies on top. How? Via 2, hegemonic norms. But now it's not white supremacy, the patriarchy. Now it's norms like the longhouse, which means like the gynocracy, the rule of women, the post-war consensus, and Judeo-Christianity. These are phrases you'll hear on the dissident right to refer to these narratives that have co-opted our minds. And then, but normies, normal people like you and me, are blind. We can't see these narratives, these norms, these hegemonic powers. So because of that, 3, we need to red pill them. Like the Matrix imagery, we have to wake them up. Normies are blind. They can't see. They're sleeping. We got to show them, really, you think everything's fine, but in reality, you're living under this oppressive regime. And the goal is then to retake the West. So I laid out those beliefs to show you what I see as these similarities in the overall structure of the beliefs. And interestingly, some of these dissident right guys on Twitter, they have a phrase they use. The phrase they use is woke, more correct than mainstream. Like the slogan, woke, more correct than mainstream, which I think is exactly what I'm saying. They're saying we agree with the woke. They flip the categories. But with the structure of the beliefs, we agree with it. I'm like, I know. I'm not calling you the woke right as a pejorative. I'm saying this looks like what they believed backwards. And they're like, yes, correct. So
it's the bizarro political universe.
It's the horseshoe theory. You've seen that picture, right? The far right and the far left actually meet. There's a great video by Ryan Long called "Woke versus Racist." Have you seen that video? It's a comedy video. The comedian, he and his friend, one of them has a T-shirt that says "woke," and the other one has a T-shirt that says "racist." And they go through all their beliefs. They're like, "We're best buddies." Like I don't believe in interracial marriage because I'm racist. But now look, listen to him. He's like, "Well, I don't believe in it because you're exoticizing the other." But we both don't agree with interracial marriage. And they're like, but they go through all their beliefs about what is, and they're like, they agree on everything, but one is just classically racist, the other guy is just super
There's
woke.
a great Saturday Night Live sketch where Kenan Thompson does this Black Jeopardy show, and if you've ever seen it, it's all about the kind of the politically correct understanding of black sub. But they had one episode where Tom Hanks plays like a Midwest Arkansas farmer guy, and all the questions that they ask he gets right, because do you trust the government? No, I don't trust them. And all the black people, yeah, you're right, we don't trust the government either. It's hilarious. It's a great clip on YouTube, but it's same idea where it's like, you come around and what you'll find is there's a lot more in common here in some of these ideologies than you may give credit for. So.
Yeah, in this case, they're all wrong. they're both equally wrong. So, but people say you're just as a slur. You're slandering people in the dissident right. I'm like, no, I'm using the word woke non-pejoratively. I'm not saying you're woke, therefore you're bad. I'm just saying, guys, look, this is exactly what I've been talking about for 5 years. I can call it something else, but it just seems like woke is a good label for this. I mean, they're literally talking about you got to wake up to reality. You're blinded by the post-war consensus, but you got to get woke. I'm like, I know.
It's very Gnostic, isn't it? I mean, the whole idea of Gnosis is right. Gnosis was the Greek word for knowledge, and it's an understanding. It's a learned knowledge, not an experiential knowledge. And the whole idea of the Gnostic program in the early church was that there's this secret knowledge. There's this secret, and tell you the truth, every religious cult trades on this. The Book of Mormon, the restored Church of Latter-day Saints, the mainstream churches got it wrong. They've been, abomination to the Lord, and we have to the restored gospel. Or the Jehovah's Witnesses say, we have it's the studies in the scriptures that are the thing that are going to clarify the scriptures, or the science and health with key to the scriptures. You can't understand the Bible by yourself. You need my special knowledge, and then you're part of the special group. And as long as you're part of the special group, then you have a knowledge that sits up and above the average person. And of course you can feel good about yourself because you're smarter than those average people. You have been enlightened. They are still in the dark. And so I see this is a very common, this is not something new in terms of motivation. This motivation has been around probably before the advent of Christianity. It's just part of human nature that you want to feel superior, and you do that by this secret knowledge. But isn't it interesting that both the right and the left have capitulated to this? Now, it's not, as you say, it's not a large portion. There are normal people out there, and I would say the vast majority of Christians don't fall into this Christian nationalist camp. There are some aspects of it to which they would agree. There may be some aspects of it that their gut reaction is, go get those guys. We need to, all of those people who tweeted, the attempted assassination on Trump, the best thing you can do for America is take aiming lessons. We need to tell their employer that and stuff like that. So you're doing the cancel culture on the opposite end. But here's the thing, what you're not doing, and what we need to do in the church, is you're not listening first to what the biblical teaching is, and then going forward from that. Luke 6, for example, right? The Sermon on the Mount. I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. That's not the message that Stephen Wolfe is offering, but that's the message that Jesus is teaching. Christianity was defined and grew primarily in its first iterations because of the martyrdom of the saints, because they would be the ones who come in and bless those who would persecute them, because they would ask God to be the one to take vengeance, but they understood that even my enemy is bears the imago Dei, and therefore has intrinsic worth, and my call as a follower of Jesus is to do good and let God sort it out at the end.
So I mentioned Carl Schmitt, and this is actually where they will invoke not only him but other people as well. And Schmitt was a kind of a lapsed Catholic, and like I said, he was a Nazi, like an actual full-on Nazi, but he was definitely not like an Orthodox Christian. But he has something called the friend-enemy distinction. And in his book, which I read, he actually talks about, well, his whole program was the purpose of politics is to reward your friends and punish your enemies. That's what the state exists to do. And in fact, even to destroy your enemies, not just to punish them, but to literally destroy them. Now, he wouldn't necessarily say genocide, but he did really tend to mean like to utterly incapacitate them so they cannot be a threat to the state. And there have been other sort of Christian nationalist adjacent people like Charles Haywood who would say the same thing, that he will say explicitly that his goal is the utter ideological defeat of the left. But then you say, well, and to destroy his enemies, which are the church's enemies, which are the America's enemies, meaning internal, not external, but internal. The left of America is an enemy that must be utterly destroyed and defeated. And how do you square that with this love your enemies thing? Well, Schmitt has a solution, and it's that Jesus was only talking about private enemies. We're supposed to love our personal private enemies, but not public enemies. And Stephen Wolfe doesn't appeal to Schmitt as far as I know, but has appealed to other Reformed theologians who make similar distinctions and say, well, Jesus isn't talking about like wartime enemies or, someone coming into your house to kill your family. We can hate them. Now, I think there is some subtle distinctions there, like just war theory talks about we can have international enemies. Jesus even talks about having enemies. But then the question is, even if you try to make a very generous case for the idea that, okay, he's not just saying literally let anyone walk all over you, but love your enemies means something. It can't mean nothing.
Right.
And if you look at the rhetoric around the left and, you are victims, they've robbed you of your heritage as Americans, and it's time to... So the last chapter, for example, the second to last chapter, I think, of Stephen Wolfe's book is about justifying violent revolution. He has an entire chapter on how, in a theory, you could justify rebelling violently against the government and overthrowing them and installing a new government. And at the end of that chapter, on how can it be politically, theologically, morally justified to violently revolt, he says at this point, many people are getting nervous and are saying, well, this is all hypothetical, right? This is a thought experiment, right? And he said, they'll want me to reassure the reader that I'm just talking speculatively and theoretically. I will not do that. We have lived far too long under the, I forget what exact words, I should actually quote him, but he look up the book. He explicitly says, I am not merely engaged in speculation. I think his last sentence is, we don't have to live like this.
Wow. Well,
so yeah, is this a large movement? No, but this is the book that Doug Wilson said is the book to read that he published to understand Christian nationalism. So I'm like, well, I mean, I'm doing what you said. I'm reading it and I'm evaluating it and quoting from it.
Well, my response to that would be actually, how do we know if Luke chapter 6 is talking about public or private? And I would say, well, let's cross-reference it with Romans 13. Romans 13, Paul writes specifically that people should be subject to governing authorities, for there's no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. Now, this is in the age of Nero. Okay? Yeah. Nero was not a friend to Christians. He was burning them in his garden in order to ride his chariot around at night. He was blaming them for the fire at Rome. This is as much a political antichrist, so to speak, as you can get. And Paul is still saying, guess what? You don't get that option.
Yeah.
Now, people may push back on this and say, well, how do you justify the American Revolution? There are reasons why we can do this, and what the Declaration of Independence states is why we are seceding. And they didn't say we're going to have a violent overthrow. They said, we just want to be left alone. Here are our grievances, and since you won't meet these grievances, we stop. Now, if you want to come after us, then fine, we'll fight. We'll protect ourselves. But that's fundamentally different than calling for a violent overthrow of the country. Because what do you replace it with? And the problem with wokeism is there is no telos, there is no end goal other than the murky, everybody will live in peace and harmony, and there will be no, everybody will have complete equity, which we know is a fantasy. It can't. But does the woke right, does the Christian nationalist, does the these alternatives, do they offer any kind of telos or any kind of ideology other than we just overthrow it and reinstall white people?
Well, yeah, and Wolf. Okay, a couple of things. One is that they have thought about these issues. So, and they do. Wolf does appeal a lot to Reformed theologians, historic Reformed theologians. He does not talk about the Bible. He says at the beginning, I'm not going to exegete scripture. What he does is he assumes the Reformed tradition. He's like, these theologians, I'm assuming, because I'm a Presbyterian, that they're correct. So he doesn't try to quote the Bible and say the Bible says such and such. He just says, assuming these theologians are correct, they will provide the framework that I use to talk about politics. And then they would say things like the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, that yeah, as private citizens, we shouldn't rebel against authorities, but could a lower authority like a governor rebel against the federal government? Would that be okay? And they would say, yeah, historically, Reformed theologians have talked about how, yes, as a private citizen, I can't rebel against the president of the U.S., but as a governor who's been entrusted with protecting the people in California, say, can I say to the tyrant who's ruling over me, no, you can't do that to my people? So they have. My point is, there aren't any quick gotchas. I said this about the woke left also. People kept saying things like, well, if hegemonic narratives are oppressive, that isn't their hegemonic narrative oppressive? And I'd be like, well, they have an answer to that, though. Or they'll say things like, if all truth is relative, that isn't your truth relative. Like, they don't believe that, though. So in the same way, the woke right has thought of answers. There's not a quick gotcha for them. What I will say, though, is there a telos? And the answer is yes. At least for Stephen Wolf, the telos is a Christian nation. Now, he wouldn't say it's whites. He actually is very clear that he does not mean only whites. He does think that there's an American ethnos, American ethnicity, and it does involve ancestry and what we might call like race, but it can be multiracial. So he would actually say explicitly, for example, that people like Clarence Thomas and Booker T. Washington, they're both black, obviously, but they are what he calls heritage Americans. They have been grafted into what he calls the Anglo-Protestant tradition. So they are his people. Yeah, I get. He's like, yeah, they're black, but like they are part. So in his vision, the core of America, the demographic core, were Anglo-Protestants, people that were British from Western Europe. And that as the country grew, that was always the sort of beating heart of America, the Anglo-Protestant core. And yes, we got immigrants from Germany and then later from Italy and Ireland and Ellis Island generation, but they always assimilated to that heritage American core. And that core also includes blacks from the Old South, things like that. And people like C.J. Angle have talked about what it means to be a So he wouldn't frame it totally in racialist terms. There are other issues there. I'm trying to be fair. I'm not saying I agree with him. I'm just saying that he doesn't just say white America's for whites. He does not say that. But his end goal is a Christian nation, and he is the ideal leader in his mind is what he calls the prince. And this is going to read some quotes again from his book. And they're going to sound terrifying, but I'm going to read them directly. He says, so again, what is it? The end goal of this project for him is a Christian nation, which is a nation that is oriented towards both the earthly and the heavenly good of its citizens, meaning salvation in Christ. Its laws are oriented towards procuring salvation in Christ for its people. Now, he doesn't think we can make people Christians by enforcing it by law. He's just saying, like, their national laws, like the Sabbath law, maybe, or their national laws, like, you can't build hypothetically, you can't build Hindu temples in America. You can't maybe even build mosques or synagogues. That's illegal. He even said, I'll just read some quotes, okay? Quote, having the highest office on earth, the good prince, the Christian prince, resembles God to the people. He is the closest image of God on earth. The prince is a sort of national God, not in the sense of being divine himself or in materially transcending common humanity, blah, 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 but as the mediator of divine rule for this nation and as one with divinely granted power. The Christian prince can adorn himself and his residence, his place of living, with Christian symbols, as crosses were once painted on royal armor. His military or militia, which defends a Christian people and their church, can be designated soldiers of Christ. The prince is an image of Christ to his people. And he says, we should pray that God would raise up a Christian prince from among us who would suppress the enemies of God and elevate his people, recover a worshiping people, restore masculine prominence in the land, and a spirit for dominion, affirm and conserve his people and place, not permitting their dissolution or capture, and inspire a love of one's Christian country. So those are all direct quotes. So that's word for word.
So we've done this at one point. It's called medievalism. I mean, that's the papacy. That's exactly what he's just described as the papacy, the vicar of Christ.
He would say that, but what about England? Not under the Roman Catholic rule, but under the Christian, the Anglican rule, right? They're Protestants. They have
Queen Elizabeth I, who persecuted the Catholic Church.
He would say, well, yes, obviously there needs to be some prudence. He would say we should learn from the failures of Christian Europe. Well, the drowning Baptists, right? That was bad. But he would say, but shouldn't we? The counter argument he'd make is, have we learned nothing from liberalism? Liberalism, we can lay at its feet, 50 million dead babies. We can lay at its feet all of the current moral chaos. That's all the result of following, quote unquote, neutral secular liberalism. Isn't it time to give Christian nationalism a chance? That would be his response.
Yeah, I obviously, and when you talk with folks like this, you'll always get pushback. Nobody just says, "Huh, okay." And they're emotionally invested in these views as much as anything else, because what's driving these views is emotional. So there's a deep-seated internal struggle that they're having, or some kind of conflict that they're feeling, some kind of personal affront that they're trying to. There's something more than just abstract rationalism that would lead you to a position of this nature. And that's why it's so passionate, and you see the passion in it. But at the same time, you have to recognize that passion means that you're not going to, immediately argue the person out of that view. I think, and maybe we should kind of close with these kinds of ideas. How then do we talk to the person who's on social media, who's reading some of these things, who doesn't know how to filter against what is appropriate, some good suggestions, and what is going too far? How do we, tell a brother or sister, well, yeah, he makes some good points here, but realize that here's the grid against you have to strain those ideas and make sure that, because there's a whole lot of bad things that you're catching along with a few of the good, right? every lie has to be wrapped in a little bit of the truth, otherwise it would be completely unappealing. So what do you think we say to the people in our congregations, the people who watch online? How do you cautiously and thoughtfully screen through some of this stuff so that you don't get caught up in it?
I think one thing, I have an article on, which I'm sure you've read, called "What is the Woke Right?" And I take some time to do that, to say how can we kind of talk people down from the ledge. I think one thing we do is um, we first of all, this is almost entirely a reaction against the woke left. This is a reactionary movement that is so fed up with the wokeness of the left that they're like, well, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to do the exact opposite, literally. And so I think one thing you can do is simply fight the woke left. If you fight the woke left and say, I have no tolerance for anti-white racism or anti-black racism, it's all racism to me. If you do that, if you say, yeah, it's not fair that people can write articles like white men are the most dangerous threat to our democracy, or white women's tears are terrorist attacks. They're just, for my last book, I had countless articles, New York Times articles, Washington Post articles, op-eds, just saying crazy things that you would never tolerate for 1 nanosecond if it were written about blacks or Asians or Hispanics, but you write them about whites or men or heterosexuals or Christians, and it's fine. We can't tolerate that. And if we are very clear that we're not okay with that, then I think that is often part of the motivation that young white guys have to get into this movement. And there's a really funny video by Hans Fiene of Lutheran satire. He did this really famous Horace Ruins Christmas video, but he has a new video called "What is Christian Nationalism?" If you haven't watched it, it's a hilarious video. But one of the characters is this angry young white 17-year-old, and he's gone off the rails, and he's now super racist and anti-Semitic. But he said in the course of this humorous video, he has a backstory. And his backstory is he says, like, I've only ever known the world we live in. And he's 17. Think about 17. If you're 17, you were what? 5 when the Supreme Court, was it 5? Wait, was it 2015? It was 2015. So if you're 17, yeah. You were 8 years old when the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. The first president you probably remember is President Obama. So, I'm 44. I remember the before times. To me, the Great Awakening is an aberration. It's an interruption of normal sanity. To a 17-year-old, that's the way world works. Everyone always has hated you. So we begin by saying, that's not okay. I don't hate you because you happen to be white-skinned and male. You can't control that. And I'm not going to tolerate that. So that's one way to kind of talk people down from the ledge, to acknowledge their concerns. I think another thing to do is to really understand what guys like Wolf are saying and not saying. I saw a lot of people just saying, he's just this raging racist. And like, he just wants a white ethno-state. I'm like, he says explicitly, like several times, he does not want a white ethno-state. He just keeps saying that. Now, you might think he's lying, but you can't hide that he says it. Like, it's not fair for you to like pretend he doesn't say it repeatedly. So I think read the books, consider their perspective, recognize the positives, steel man their arguments, and then you'll hopefully at least win respect from people that are tempted by that. If you just say you're just an idiot, you only believe this because you're an emotional person, like, well, that's not going to go over well with them. If you say, I've read that book, here are the points I agreed with, that hopefully will open up room for dialogue where you can say, wait a minute though, here's my problem with it. Okay, now you've earned the chance to critique it. And the last thing I would just say is the Bible. I think one criticism of Wolf's book is that he outright says, I'm not going to exegete scripture. Now, in his defense, he says, I'm going to rely on these reformers because that's my tradition. That's fine. But then it's also fine for us to say, but here's what the Bible says. The Bible does take precedence over the writings of Turretin, or, name your reformer. So I think that's what I would lean on. Like you said, pull out Romans 13, pull out Luke 6 and say, is this really what Jesus was getting at? Does Jesus really mean that it's fine to hate people and to loathe them as long as you can somehow label them public enemies. I don't think that's what Jesus was getting at. A really important parable, I think, for this is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Because in that story, the hero of the story is the Good Samaritan, who was an ethnic and a national and a religious enemy.
Right.
The Jews hated the Samaritans. They were actually heretics. They didn't believe the right religion. They had really messed up stuff.
And it was the answer to who is my neighbor? Love your neighbor. Who is my neighbor?
And yes, and go and do likewise. Not only is Jesus saying this is your neighbor, that's the one that Jesus says you're to love as you love yourself. And the entire parable was taught in response to the guy asking what? Who is my neighbor?
Right.
I don't want to, you can't possibly mean I have to love just anybody. And Jesus is like, exactly. That is exactly what I'm telling you to do as the second greatest commandment. So I think that is really, if I had to pick one text to go to call into question, maybe not particular claims, but just the overall project of the woke right, it's that parable and say, what does Jesus mean here? Who does he define as your neighbor? And what is the not the greatest commandment to love God, but the second greatest commandment that is like unto the first commandment to love your neighbor? It is talking about the ethnic, religious, and national enemy of your people.
Yeah,
that's your neighbor.
So here's what I would say, because one of the stark differences between Christianity and, say, Islam, and I make this point all the time when I'm talking to Muslim friends, is I would say when you look at Islam, Muhammad is the ultimate exemplar of the Islamic ideal. There is not a Muslim on earth who would say, no, Muhammad's not the guy we're supposed to emulate. Right, he just isn't. I mean, that you nobody. I don't care what part of Islam you're from. Muhammad's the guy. And what did Muhammad do? Well, he was pillaging, marrying 9-year-olds. I mean, Muhammad's got a whole ton of skeletons in his closet. Mm-hmm. And usually, I make the point of, okay, now let's compare Muhammad's character to Jesus's character. What did Jesus do? Did he actually turn the other cheek when the Roman authority came? Yeah, he did. He healed the guy's ear when they came to arrest him, for crying out loud. That's a Jewish temple authority, but it was still. So when you look at this, when you look at the suggestions that they're making, put Jesus in the middle. Would Jesus have done that? Do you see? Can you write a compelling piece of scripture where Jesus gathers a group behind him and says, "Grab your swords, we're going to overthrow Rome"? Isn't that what they kept asking him to do? And he said, no, you don't get it. So put Jesus right in the middle of that. We go to weddings and we read 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind, right? And we say, if you want to understand how Jesus loves you, put your name in there instead of, you're supposed to be patient and kind, but you know that Jesus is patient, Jesus is kind, Jesus is long-suffering, and et cetera, et cetera. And we take those things to ourselves. Oh, yes, Jesus treats me that way even when I mess up, even when I continue to mess up. But now you're going to have to say, would Jesus do this on broad scale? Or are the Christian nationalists just wrong? And I don't see how you can get a Jesus in a Christian nationalist garb. I just don't see how that it just doesn't fit. It feels wrong. It feels like Muhammad.
They usually, interestingly, if you look at their writings and their exemplars, they usually do appeal to the Old Testament. That's more their model for how the state should act. And they'll say, well, see, Jesus wasn't running a state. And so I think they'll maybe own that and say, yeah, Jesus was all the things you said, but he wasn't teaching us about how to rule a state. We have to look to the Old Testament to understand how God wants the state to run. It's a whole different conversation. But again, like I said, there's no gotcha questions.
Right.
They have thought of these things. And they would, I want to be fair, I do think they would say, Jesus did not give us a plan for how the government is to run, but the Old Testament did. And they'll appeal to the Old Testament.
Yeah, and I would say, and how did that end for them? How Jerusalem was overthrown not once but twice, because in both instances that doesn't work. It simply doesn't work.
I think they're well. I don't. I won't speculate too much, but they like I said, just don't expect layups and dunks.
Sure. No, I agree with
Not you personally. I'm just saying in general, because I think with the woke left, people walked in there thinking this is going to be a cakewalk. I'm like, guys, this has been going on for 150 years. They have thought of your responses, they have anticipated them, and I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying that do your homework. That's all. That's all. That's my only thing.
Okay. Okay. Well, it's so good talking with you, Neil. So good catching up. I appreciate it so much. This is an important topic. Like I said, I think people do need to be careful, understand that it's out there. I don't think it's the threat. And I do agree with you that in our political discourse, this nomenclature has been picked up and used as a cudgel. And it's an easy millstone to try and hang around anyone's neck to disavow them. Just like the term Nazi or fascist is thrown around, and you say, well, what does that mean? Usually that's what it takes. Usually it takes, what do you mean by that? Can you help me by defining it? And if you can't define it, then why are you using it? You can at least ask them those questions. Maybe that would prevent them from abusing it somewhat. But the idea, it's rhetoric. Right? It's polemics. It's meant to evoke a visceral reaction, which is actually a logical fallacy. So it's not about clear thinking. And the more clarity we get into this conversation, I think the better we are for ourselves in able to distinguish the good between bad. Test all things, hold fast to that which is good. Apostle Paul tells us, and that's our calling. So thank you so much. Appreciate this, and I'll talk to you soon. All right.
Yeah. Thanks, Lenny.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.